Not swords, but a curse of broken love. Not a thirst for territory, but the ashes of a funeral pyre. Such, according to the great Roman poet Virgil, was the beginning of one of the most enduring and bloody feuds in human history. When the hero Aeneas, the ancestor of the Romans, betrayed and abandoned Dido, queen of Carthage, spread hatred upon his lineage and all his descendants after him. There will be no love, no treaty between our two peoples. A legendary curse for a real war. A titanic confrontation between the two most powerful powers in the Mediterranean. On one side was the Roman Republic, a young beast rising like a storm from the Italian peninsula, with the most disciplined and skilled infantry in the world. On the other side was the Carthaginian Empire, a giant octopus, a rich and ancient maritime merchant empire, with powerful tentacles extending across the coasts of North Africa, southern Spain, and the strategic islands. They were descendants of the Phoenicians, and the Romans called them Poenici or Punic. For years, these two giants have viewed each other with a mixture of wariness and respect. They were even allies in their fight against Pyrrhus, king of Epirus, for control of southern Italy. But this fragile balance of power is about to be disrupted, and the fateful battlefield will be an island between them, a jewel that both covet, Sicily. It all began not with the Senate or the royal councils, but with a group of masterless mercenaries. In 288 BC, after the death of Agathocles, the tyrant of Syracuse, his Campanian mercenary army suddenly found itself unemployed. Instead of disbanding, they decided to start a business of their own in the most brutal way possible. They targeted the city of Messina, today Messina, a strategic location at the gateway to the Italian peninsula. In one terrible night, they massacred or banished the entire male population, enslaved the women and children, and seized their homes and property. They called themselves the Mamertines, children of war. But in reality, they were nothing more than a brutal band of robbers, a malignant tumor that spread terror throughout northeastern Sicily. Their reign of terror lasted for more than 20 years, until a hero arose. In 264 BC, Hieron, the new ruler of Syracuse, more daring faction proposed an even bigger gamble to appeal to Rome for help. This was an almost insane idea. Rome was a land power. Its navy was virtually non-existent, and it had no tradition of military intervention outside the Italian peninsula. Moreover, only a few years earlier, Rome had punished another group of Campanian mercenaries for similar behavior. Helping the Mamertines would be blatant hypocrisy. The letter of appeal was sent to the Roman Senate, causing a heated debate. Some senators believed that intervention was necessary. If Rome did not act, Carthage certainly would. Allowing Carthage to control Messina, the strategic bottleneck between Sicily and Italy, would be an existential threat, a knife to the Republic's throat. But others were hesitant, not wanting to spark a large-scale war with a powerful rival like Carthage over a ragtag group of mercenaries. The debate went nowhere. Finally, the decision was pushed to the People's Council, and before a crowd stirred by promises of glory and booty, the balance tipped in favor of war. An army of 20,000 men under the command of the consul Appius Claudius was ordered to set out. But when the Roman vanguard, led by a second-in-command also named Claudius, arrived, they were in for a shock. The port of Messina was packed with Carthaginian warships and soldiers. The Mamertines, in their panic, sent out a distress call to both giants, and Carthage arrived first attacking and routing Hieron's army, forcing him to retreat. Then they turned north, facing Hanno. The Carthaginians were quickly defeated. The siege of Messina was won. The first spark of the First Punic War had been lit, and it quickly flared into an inferno. The lightning victory at Messina had fanned the flames of Roman confidence. They had tasted the blood of their enemies, and now they wanted more. Their next target was none other than Syracuse, the most powerful Greek city in Sicily, the seat of their recently defeated king. Hieron, Appius Claudius led his army south, believing that a preemptive strike would cause the fall of Syracuse and end the war on the island quickly. But he was wrong. Hieron, though defeated in the field, was a master of defense. The walls of Syracuse were virtually impregnable, and the king had an ally even more formidable than fortifications: disease. When the Roman legions set up camp around the city, they soon found themselves fighting an invisible enemy. The marshes around Syracuse were breeding grounds for mosquitoes, and before long, marsh fever, malaria, began to sweep through the Roman ranks, sapping their fighting strength more than the enemy's swords. The siege dragged on into 263 BC. Hieron simply held out within the fortified walls, while illness did the rest. Finally, an iron law of the Roman Republic took effect. Appius Claudius's annual consulship ended. He was recalled to Rome, and two new consuls, Otis Silius Crassus and Maximus Messala, were sent to replace him. They did not come alone. With them came a fresh wave of reinforcements: 16,000 infantry and 1,200 cavalry. This was one of Rome's most formidable strengths: its seemingly inexhaustible ability to mobilize and replenish its manpower. The Roman army, now reinforced, withdrew from Syracuse to reorganize. Hieron followed, but he began to notice something strange. Whenever the scouting parties of the two sides encountered each other, not only did they not engage, but they actively conversed with each other. His Greek soldiers seemed to feel closer to the Roman Italic soldiers than to the Carthaginian mercenaries, his reluctant allies. Hieron was a shrewd politician. He sensed the changing winds of public opinion. He saw the brutality, discipline, and iron determination of Rome. He realized that opposing them would be suicidal. Meanwhile, allying with them could secure Syracuse's throne and autonomy for decades to come. This was a decisive moment, not just for Hieron, but for the war. The king of Syracuse had made a choice that would reshape the balance of power. He had switched sides. He sent envoys to the Roman consuls, proposing an alliance. For Rome, this was a godsend. Not only did they get rid of a formidable enemy, but they also gained a strategic ally in Sicily. Hieron agreed to pay a tribute of 200 silver talents, a small price to pay for the safety of his kingdom. From that time until his death, Hieron remained one of the Roman Republic's most loyal and trusted allies. With their rear guard secured, Crassus and Messala were now free to deal with Carthage. They marched to confront General Hanno at the Battle of Himera. Once again, the power of the Roman legions was demonstrated. The Carthaginians were routed. This victory created a domino effect. 67 towns and cities, previously under Carthage control, quickly declared their allegiance to Rome. In a short time, Rome went from being an outsider to the dominant power over much of the island. Their initial campaign was successful beyond all expectations. But Carthage was not an empire to give up easily. News of repeated defeats in Sicily sent shockwaves back home, but it only strengthened their resolve. They would not abandon Sicily, the jewel of their empire. In 262 BC, full command of the land campaigns was given to a new general, Hannibal Gisco. Unlike Rome, the Carthaginian army relied heavily on mercenaries and allies, rather than conscripted citizens. To see whether the discipline of the Roman legions could stand up to the overwhelming numbers and impregnable walls of Carthage, the entire Mediterranean world waited with bated breath. When the Roman legions of Postumius and Mamilius arrived before the mighty walls of Agrigentum, they committed the fatal mistake of the proud. They underestimated their opponents. Believing that victory would come easily, the consuls did not even establish a solid defense for their camp. Worse still, they spread their already small forces thin by sending large detachments to forage in the vicinity. Inside the city, Hannibal Gisco observed every move through the watchtowers. He saw the enemy's complacency. This was the golden opportunity. Immediately, Gisco ordered a large force to suddenly attack, aiming straight at the Roman army's simple camp. He hoped to destroy the enemy in a lightning attack. Gisco's hopes were almost realized, but they were dashed by the heroic sacrifice of the remaining Roman guards. Though outnumbered, they fought to the last man. They knew they could not win, but they could buy time. Their stubborn and desperate resistance created enough noise and confusion to alert the distant food-gathering parties. These soldiers rushed back, joined in the fight, and repelled Gisco's attack. The Roman camp was saved, but it was a costly wake-up call. In the following days, Gisco became more cautious, limiting his actions to harassing the Romans with long-range attacks. Meanwhile, the legionaries, recovering from their initial shock, did what they did best: build. They quickly expanded and fortified their camp into a veritable fortress. They built not one, but two separate camps, linked by a system of trenches and double earthen walls. One line of defense faced Agrigentum, to protect against Gisco's sorties. The other faced outward, to guard against any attacks from the rear. The hunter had now become the prey. Gisco and his 50,000 men were besieged within their own city. Years passed. The siege dragged on. Inside Agrigentum, the vast food reserves began to run out. Famine loomed. Gisco was forced to send an urgent message to Carthage, pleading for reinforcements. The Carthaginian Senate swung into action. A new army was assembled, led by another general named Hanno. This included 6,000 skilled Numidian cavalry, and, for the first time in the war, a terrifying weapon the Romans had never faced in battle. 50 war Elephants. Hanno landed in Sicily and established his base at Heraclea. From there, he launched a surprise attack and captured Urbessus, a small town that was a logistics center and a food depot for the Roman army. With a single strike, Hanno completely cut off the enemy's supply lines. The situation had now turned dramatically. The Romans, who had been besieging, were now themselves besieged. They were sandwiched between Gisco in front and Hanno behind. Hanno's hammer and Gisco's anvil were ready to crush them. Famine and disease, the weapons that had helped them against Syracuse, were now turned against them. Postumius and Mamilius realized that their position was untenable. They had only one choice: to cut a bloody path, break through Hanno's siege, and escape. They ordered the legionaries, exhausted by hunger, to prepare for a life-or-death battle. As dawn broke, the Romans emerged from their fortifications and faced Hanno's army on the plain. Hanno formed his battle lines in two: heavy infantry in front, war elephants, and reserves in the rear. The formidable Numidian cavalry protected the flanks. The battle began with a cavalry duel, and this is where the Romans realized their inferiority. Their cavalry, which was only a support force, was no match for the light, agile, and skilled Numidian knights. The Numidians galloped around, throwing their javelins accurately from a distance, wearing down and disorganizing the Roman cavalry before charging in and sweeping them from the battlefield. But on the ground, it was a completely different story. When the Roman infantry met the Carthaginian infantry, the true power of the legions was demonstrated. The manipulous soldiers, with their iron discipline and superb fighting skills, penetrated the Carthaginian defenses. They pushed back the first line, causing it to collapse and causing chaos for the second line. At that crucial moment, a small Roman force successfully carried out a surprise rearguard attack. Their appearance in the rear of the Carthaginians caused a great panic. But the most panicked were the war elephants, turned around and trampled the Carthaginians standing behind them. 30 elephants died in the chaos, but the damage they inflicted on their own troops was even greater. Anno, seeing his army disintegrate, was forced to order a retreat to Heraclea. The Roman consuls now turned to deal with Gisco, but the cunning general proved himself a master of escape. Taking advantage of the dark and cold winter night, he had his men sneak out of Agrigentum. They carried sacks of straw to fill the Roman trenches, climbed over earthen walls, and passed through guard posts undetected. The next morning, the Romans discovered that they had been tricked. Their biggest prey had escaped. They still had one target, though: the city of Agrigentum. With no army to defend it, the city surrendered immediately. But that did not save them from the tragic fate of places taken by force. Roman legions swept in, plundered all its wealth, and captured 25,000 inhabitants to sell into slavery. The Battle of Agrigentum was the first major engagement of the war, a costly but crucial victory. It pushed Carthage back to the west of the island, but it also taught Rome a valuable lesson. As long as Carthage dominated the sea, it could never achieve final victory. The land war had reached its limits. Now it was time for Rome to face its greatest fear, the ocean. The victory at Agrigentum consolidated Roman control on land, but it also exposed an undeniable truth. The war could not be decided by legions alone. As long as Carthage was master of the sea, it could easily supply the remaining strongholds in Sicily, harass the Italian coast, and move its armies freely. The war had descended into a strategic stalemate. Rome was a fierce wolf on land, but helpless in the ocean. Carthage was a giant shark in the water, but clumsy on land. The two giants were locked in two different arenas. The Roman Senate understood that, to win, the wolf would have to learn to swim. But this was more than a challenge. It was an almost impossible one. The Roman navy at the time consisted of only a few triremes, small ships primarily used for coastal patrols and anti-piracy operations. They were too few and too weak to confront the mighty Carthaginian fleet, which was equipped with hundreds of quinquiremes, giant five-row warships that were the pinnacle of naval technology at the time. The Romans needed their own quinquiremes, but how? They had no blueprints, no shipbuilding experience, and most importantly, no naval tradition. And then, fate intervened, as if by a gift from Neptune. A Carthaginian quinquireme was caught in a storm during a patrol and washed ashore on the Italian coast. The Romans seized this golden opportunity. Roman engineers disassembled the shipwreck, studying every piece of wood, every joint. They copied and duplicated it with a speed and scale that amazed the world. According to the historian Polybius, in just 60 days, Rome and its allies built an entirely new fleet of 100 quinquiremes and 20 triremes. It was a feat of engineering and logistics, a testament to the organizational capacity and iron will of the Republic. But building the ships was only half the problem. Such a fleet required at least 30,000 trained oarsmen to operate it properly. How could such a huge crew be trained before the ship was launched? The Romans came up with a very practical and original solution. They had huge wooden scaffolds built right on the beaches, exactly replicating the structure and position of the benches inside a ship. Thousands and thousands of peasants, who had never seen the sea, sat on these scaffolds, day in and day out, practicing rowing on dry land. They learned to follow the beat of the drum and the commander's orders, coordinating their movements until it became second nature. When the ships were actually launched, they had a basic crew of trained oarsmen ready. However, the Romans were also realistic enough to know that they could not become master sailors overnight. The skills of handling ships, making sharp turns, and especially the technique of ramming the bronze-clad bow into the side of an enemy ship, required years of experience. A green Roman crew would be easy prey for the experienced Carthaginian captains. They knew they could not win at Carthage's game, so they decided to change the rules. Roman engineers had invented a secret weapon that would change the face of naval warfare forever. It was called the Corvus, Latin for raven. It was a movable bridge about 11 meters long, attached to a mast at the front of the ship. At the bottom of the bridge was a heavy, sharp iron beak, like a raven's beak. When an enemy ship got close enough, the Romans would drop the bridge. The iron beak would sink deep into the enemy's deck, locking the two ships together. This deadly bridge could rotate, allowing it to attack targets from multiple directions. Then, the legionnaires, masters of land warfare, would swarm across the bridge, turning the enemy's deck into a familiar battlefield. Thanks to Corvus, the Romans had nullified any advantage Carthage had in speed and mobility. They had turned a sophisticated naval battle into a brutal land battle. It was a quintessentially Roman solution, direct, efficient, and deadly. This new fleet and new tactics were put to the test in 260 BC. Initially, command was given to the consul Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio, but he, in an act of overconfidence and inexperience, was easily tricked and captured by a smaller Carthaginian fleet off the Lipari Islands. It was a humiliating start. Command then passed to the other consul, Gaius Duilius, who was clearly the more capable. Duilius heard that the Carthaginian fleet, commanded by Hannibal Gisco, the general in Agrigentum, their iron beaks digging into the Carthaginian decks. Before the Carthaginian sailors could comprehend what was happening, they saw the fully armed Roman soldiers, with huge scutum shields and sharp gladius swords, roaring across the bridge. The other Carthaginian ships tried to flank them, tried to break the Roman oars. But to their amazement, the monstrous Corvus turned 90 degrees and caught them just as effectively. In an instant, the Carthaginian fleet, the pride of the empire, was locked in a deadly embrace. More than 50 of their ships were captured or destroyed. Gisco, in a panic, ordered the rest of the fleet to retreat. The Battle of Mylae was an incredible victory. The Roman eagle not only learned to swim, it grew sharp talons in the middle of the sea. For the first time in history, Rome had defeated Carthage on its own turf. Everything had changed. The victory at Mylae gave Rome more than a fleet. It gave it confidence. The confidence of a challenger now powerful enough to overthrow the king. But the war in Sicily remained a quagmire. Every inch of land was bought and sold in blood. Every stronghold was paid for with long sieges. The Roman Senate, in a stroke of unprecedented boldness, decided that the quickest way to cut off the head of the Carthaginian serpent was to strike at its lair. The plan was drawn up. They would bypass the long war in Sicily and open a new front in North Africa. This was the greatest gamble in ancient history. A large-scale amphibious expedition across hostile waters against a powerful naval empire was almost suicidal. But Rome was ready. They put all their resources into this gamble. In the summer of 256 BC, a spectacle of unprecedented magnitude unfolded at the port of Messana. Rome had assembled a huge fleet of 330 quinquiremes, each carrying 300 oarsmen and 120 marines. In all, nearly 140,000 men, the population of a large city at the time, were mobilized for the invasion. This was no longer a fleet, but a floating city, a giant war machine preparing to set sail. News of this preparation quickly reached Carthage. They understood the danger. If this fleet reached Africa, their homeland would be devastated. They had to stop it at all costs. Carthage also threw its weight behind it, assembling an even larger fleet with 350 warships and 150,000 sailors, under the command of two generals, Hamilcar and Hanno. The two largest fleets in history were about to meet off the southern coast of Sicily at a place called Cape Ecnomus. The outcome of this battle would decide the fate of the invasion. The Roman consuls, Marcus Attilius Regulus and Lucius Manlius, knew that their ships were slower and more maneuverable than their enemies. So they devised a very clever battle formation to protect their precious transport ships. Their two main fleets formed a giant wedge, led by the consuls themselves. A third fleet formed a horizontal line at the base of the wedge, towing the transport ships. And finally, a fourth fleet, likened to the elite triarii soldiers, formed a final horizontal line to provide the rear guard. This formation was like a giant drill, designed to puncture the enemy's heart while protecting the vulnerable core. The Carthaginian fleet, as it approached, formed a long line, intending to execute a classic pincer movement to encircle the entire Roman fleet. Their plan was to feign retreat in the center to lure the two Roman vanguard fleets into pursuit, thereby stretching and breaking the enemy's tight formation. The battle began. The Roman consuls, seeing the fragile Carthaginian ranks, ordered their wedge-shaped fleets to accelerate forward. As expected, the Carthaginian center turned and fled. The Romans gave chase in hot pursuit. The trap was set. The Roman line was stretched out, leaving the transports and rearguard fleet behind, isolated. Instantly, the Carthaginian center turned 180 degrees and charged at the pursuers. At the same time, the two wings of the Carthaginian fleet began to close in. A huge, chaotic naval battle broke out on three separate fronts. The Carthaginians, with their more agile ships, circled the Roman ships, trying to make flanking rams. But the Romans, once again, had Corvus. Every time a Carthaginian ship got close enough, the bridge of death was lowered, and the legionaries turned the battle into a bloody duel. In the central battle, the forces of the two consuls fought fiercely and gradually gained the upper hand. Hamilcar was forced to order his fleet to retreat completely. But instead of pursuing, Regulus showed excellent command. He ordered his fleet to turn back and relieve the rearguard fleet, which was being pressed by the Carthaginian right wing under Hanno. Hanno's fleet was now caught between two Roman pincers and was quickly routed. Finally, the two victorious Roman fleets joined forces, encircling and destroying the Carthaginian left wing, which was forcing their third fleet ashore. The battle ended in a complete victory for the Romans. They lost 24 ships, but sank 30 and captured 64 of the Carthaginians. The road to Africa was open. The armies of Regulus and Manlius landed on the coast of North Africa and quickly captured the city of Aspes. From there, they began a systematic campaign of destruction. The land around Carthage was one of the most fertile agricultural regions in the ancient world. The Roman legions plundered it mercilessly, burning farms and villas, driving away countless livestock, and capturing more than 20,000 local people to sell into slavery. But it was at this point that the Roman Senate made a serious strategic mistake. Perhaps blinded by the enormous booty, they ordered Manlius with most of the fleet and half of the army back to Rome. Regulus was left to complete the conquest with only 15,000 infantry and 500 cavalry. Regulus continued to win, however. At the Battle of Audes, he defeated a Carthaginian army that had mistakenly placed its cavalry and war elephants on a hill, nullifying its greatest advantage. Regulus was now only a few miles from Carthage. The city was in panic, its food supplies were cut off, refugees were pouring in, causing famine and disease. Carthage was on the brink of collapse. Backed into a corner by Regulus' humiliating terms, Carthage had only two options left: surrender and be erased from history, or fight on with the madness of those with nothing left to lose, bringing with it a new group of mercenaries. Among them was a man named Xanthippus, a warrior from Sparta. He was neither a king nor a noble, but a professional soldier, a master of infantry tactics. Forged in the brutal wars of the Greek world, Xanthippus began to learn about Carthage's recent defeats. He listened to stories of the Battle of Audes. He assessed the strengths and weaknesses of the Carthaginian army, and in a short time, he came to a conclusion so surprisingly simple, an obvious truth that none of the Carthaginian generals realized. He declared to the Carthaginian leaders, "You have lost not because the Romans are stronger, but because your generals do not know how to use their weapons." He pointed out that Carthage's greatest advantages were its superior Numidian cavalry and its hundreds of fearsome war elephants. Both of these weapons were most effective on flat, open terrain. Yet the Carthaginian generals repeatedly drove their troops into narrow hills, negating their own advantage and engaging the Roman infantry where they were strongest. Xanthippus' analysis was razor-sharp, straightforward, and undeniably logical. In desperation, the Carthaginian Senate did something unprecedented. They gave full command of the army to a foreign mercenary. Xanthippus immediately set to work. He assembled a force of 12,000 infantry, 4,000 cavalry, and nearly 100 war elephants. He led them out of the city, straight into the vast plain between Tunis and the Bagradas River. He would face Regulus on a battlefield of his own choosing. Regulus, seeing the Carthaginians advancing, was delighted. Pride had not yet deserted him. He eagerly accepted the challenge, leading his 15,000 legionaries and 500 cavalry out of the camp. Xanthippus deployed his battle lines ingeniously, Hundreds of war elephants were arranged in a single line in front, like a living wall of flesh and blood. Behind them was a dense phalanx of infantry, held back by the phalanx and slaughtered by the cavalry from the flanks and rear. It was a massacre. Of the 15,500 Romans, 13,000 were massacred. Only 2,000 were lucky enough to escape. The consul Marcus Atilius Regulus, who had only a few days before decided the fate of Carthage, tried to flee with 500 of his guards. But the Carthaginian cavalry caught up and captured them all. The Roman expedition to Africa ended in total disaster. Xanthippus, the Spartan savior, after performing his feat, wisely accepted his reward and quickly left Carthage, before the jealousy of the local generals could harm him. In Rome, the news of the disaster caused great shock, but did not break them. With characteristic tenacity, the Senate immediately ordered the construction of a new fleet to rescue the 2,000 survivors besieged at Aspis. A huge fleet of 350 warships was dispatched. Along the way, they even defeated the Carthaginian fleet in a battle off Cape Hermium, capturing 114 enemy ships. They picked up the survivors, loaded them with booty, and began their return journey. But it seems the gods decided that the punishment for Rome was not enough. As this huge fleet was sailing along the southern coast of Sicily, near Camarina, a terrible storm arose. This was no ordinary storm, but a fierce hurricane, a fury of the sea. The sea, the reluctant ally that had helped Rome to create Corvus and win the war, now turned against them. The mountain-high waves lifted the warships and smashed them together or threw them against the sharp cliffs. Of the more than 350 ships, only 80 survived, more than 100,000 soldiers. Sailors and rowers were lost to the sea. The historian Polybius called it the greatest naval disaster in all history. He blamed the consuls for their arrogance in ignoring the warnings of experienced pilots about sailing in the dangerous season. The African gamble ended in utter failure, both on land and at sea. Rome paid a terrible price for its arrogance. The disaster in Africa and the fury of the seas dealt a crushing blow to Rome, but it did not break its spirit. With an almost absurd stubbornness, the Senate did the unthinkable. It ordered the construction of a new fleet. In just 3 months, 220 new ships were launched. In 254 BC, this fleet, carrying legionnaires, sailed to Sicily and captured Panormus, one of the most important and richest Carthaginian cities on the island. A victory that was important for Rome to regain some of its honor. But Neptune apparently had not forgiven them. The following summer, 253 BC, another Roman fleet, after raiding the coast of Africa, was hit by another terrible storm on its way back. More than 150 ships were destroyed. This was the last straw. The two storms cost Rome more than 500 warships and perhaps nearly 200,000 lives. The national treasury was depleted. The navy's morale was shattered. The Senate finally had to accept the harsh truth. They could not fight the sea. They decided to stop large-scale naval campaigns. In an unexpected way, Roman hesitation made the Carthaginian general Hasdrubal complacent. Seeing that the Roman force at Panormus had been halved, he decided that now was the time to strike a decisive blow. He led his army and 140 war elephants toward Panormus, believing that the Romans would cower in fear within the city walls. But the Roman consul there, Lucius Caecilius Metellus, was a shrewd man. He set the perfect trap. He feigned fear, ordering his men to stay behind the city walls, luring Hasdrubal closer. He left his elite light infantry, Velites, hidden in the deep ditch surrounding the city. As Hasdrubal brought his infantry and war elephants to the foot of the wall, Metellus gave the signal. The Velites rushed out of the ditch, hurling volleys of javelins at the flanks of the elephants. Caught unawares, the elephants became enraged. Their mahouts urged them forward. But the Velites quickly jumped back into the ditch, safe from the deadly trampling. From the wall, a hail of arrows and stones also fell. Angered, wounded, and unable to attack the enemy, the elephants began to panic. They turned around, and in their frenzy, They trampled the very ranks of the Carthaginian infantry advancing behind them. At that moment, Metellus delivered his main blow. The gates on the other flank were thrown open, and his heavy infantry, still fresh, charged into the flank of the disarrayed Carthaginian army. The result was a massacre. The Carthaginians were routed, and most importantly, Metellus captured the remaining war elephants. The victory at Panormus had enormous psychological significance. It demonstrated to every Roman soldier that these monsters were not invincible. Fear had been broken. Restored in confidence, Rome devoted itself to a final land effort. It built another fleet, not for battle, but for the siege of Lilybaeum, the virtually impregnable fortress and Carthage's last major base in Sicily. The siege lasted for years, a battle of siegecraft, tunnels, night sorties, and extreme tenacity on both sides. Against this backdrop, in 249 BC, another disaster struck. The new consul, Publius Claudius Pulcher, an arrogant and impulsive man, decided to launch a surprise naval attack on the nearby port of Drepana. Before the battle, according to custom, he performed a divination ritual using sacred chickens. The chickens refused to eat, a very bad omen. Enraged, Pulcher shouted, "If they don't want to eat, let them drink," and threw them into the sea. This sacrilegious act was a harbinger of disaster to come. His attack was completely chaotic and was easily defeated by the Carthaginian admiral at Herbal. Nearly 100 Roman ships were captured or sunk. It was Rome's heaviest naval defeat in a direct battle. The war seemed to drag on forever. Both sides were exhausted. And then, in 247 BC, Carthage unleashed its most formidable weapon. Not a new fleet, nor war elephants, but a man, Hamilcar Barca, father of the great Hannibal. Hamilcar was a military genius with a completely different mindset. He arrived in Sicily with a small force, and he knew he could not take on the Roman legions head-on. So he didn't. He turned the war into his own playground. He landed and dramatically captured Mount Herct, a nearly impregnable natural fortress right in the middle of the Roman positions. From there, for 7 years, he waged a masterful guerrilla campaign. His army moved like ghosts, blitzing supply convoys, ambushing patrols, then disappearing back into their mountain bases. He forced the Romans to spread themselves thin, bleeding them slowly from 1,000 tiny cuts. The historian Polybius likened this phase of the war to a boxing match between two exhausted fighters. They embraced each other, exchanging feeble blows, neither able to deliver the finishing blow. Hamilcar Barca, with his talent, kept Carthage alive in the fight, holding off the mighty Roman war machine with only a handful of mercenaries. The war had lasted for more than 2 decades, a war of attrition, and it seemed as if it would never end. The war had lasted more than 20 years. 2 decades of relentless fighting, of terrible disasters, and of sheer exhaustion. Both Rome and Carthage were weary. The legions were held back in Sicily by the genius of Hamilcar Barca. The Carthaginian fleet, though weakened, still controlled the vital sea lanes. The war seemed to have become a chronic wound, which neither side had the strength to heal, nor the strength to finish the other. But it was at its darkest moment that Rome demonstrated the quality that had made it great, its indomitable will. The state treasury was completely empty. The Senate could not finance another fleet. It seemed that this was the end of its maritime ambitions. But then something extraordinary happened. The richest citizens of Rome, the patrician families, came forward voluntarily. They used their own personal wealth, lending the state interest-free money to build a final fleet. It was an act of unparalleled patriotism, a sacrifice of the elite for the glory of the Republic. 200 of the most modern quinquiremes were built. These ships were unlike any other. They were based on a captured Carthaginian ship, lighter, faster, and more maneuverable. The new consul, Gaius Lutatius Catullus, was in no hurry to send them into battle. He spent months training his crew, honing them to become experts, not only in Corvus, but also in the art of handling ships. He was preparing for a decisive battle, and this time, Rome would win by Carthage's own rules. In Carthage, the news of the new Roman fleet came as a shock. They were also exhausted and could only muster a patchwork fleet. The main task of this fleet, commanded by General Hanno, was not to engage in battle, but rather a desperate supply mission, to bypass the Roman blockade and deliver food to Hamilcar's isolated army at Eryx. Hanno's plan was to unload his cargo, pick up Hamilcar's veterans, and then attempt to engage. This meant that his ships were now heavily loaded, heavy, and slow. Catullus learned of Hanno's plans. He placed his fleet in ambush near the Aegates Islands, blocking the enemy's path. On the morning of March 10th, 241 BC, the Carthaginian fleet appeared. A strong wind blew from the west, favorable to Hanno, but also made the sea rough. Catullus was faced with a difficult choice: to engage in dangerous weather conditions, or to let Hanno escape. He chose to fight. He ordered his fleet to line up and row against the tide, facing the enemy head-on. As the two fleets charged, the difference became clear. The Roman ships, light and manned by skilled sailors, sailed with ease. The Carthaginian ships, heavy with cargo and manned by newly recruited oarsmen, were extremely clumsy. This time, Corvus was not needed. The Roman bows rammed the Carthaginian ships, and their marines swarmed over and took over the remaining ships. The battle ended quickly and brutally. 50 Carthaginian ships were sunk, and another 70 were captured along with their crews. Hanno's fleet was wiped out. Hamilcar's supply lines were cut off completely. On Mount Eryx, Hamilcar Barca, the undefeated general, was now completely isolated. He knew that resistance could no longer continue. Carthage had given him full authority to negotiate. Hamilcar sent envoys to Catullus to ask for peace. Catullus, knowing that Rome was exhausted, agreed to negotiate. The longest and bloodiest war in human history up to that point, a war that had claimed the lives of nearly 1 million people, was finally over. The peace terms were extremely harsh. Carthage was to withdraw completely from Sicily, pledge not to wage war against Syracuse, return all Roman prisoners of war, and most importantly, pay a huge war indemnity of 3,200 talents of silver over 10 years. Carthage was defeated, humiliated, and financially drained. But their tragedy was not over. Soon after peace was restored, an even more terrible war broke out in their own homeland. Exhausted by war expenses, Carthage could not pay the tens of thousands of mercenaries who fought for them. These soldiers revolted, starting a conflict that became known as the Mercenary War, a war without rules, without mercy. Carthage was pushed to the brink of destruction, and once again, they had to rely on Hamilcar Barca to save their people. And it was while Carthage was struggling in this life-and-death struggle that Rome struck its final betrayal. Taking advantage of the chaos of its opponents, they seized the 2 islands of Sardinia and Corsica, long Carthaginian colonies. When Carthage protested, Rome threatened war again, forcing Carthage to pay another 1,200 talents of silver to buy peace. This treacherous and opportunistic act was the final humiliation. It instilled in Hamilcar Barca and many other Carthaginians a hatred that never died. Hamilcar knew that this peace was only temporary. Another war with Rome was inevitable. He needed to prepare. He needed a new base, a new army, and new resources. He turned his eyes to the Iberian Peninsula, modern-day Spain. In 238 BC, before starting his great conquest of Spain, Hamilcar performed a sacrifice to the gods. His son, a boy of only 9 years old, expressed his desire to accompany his father. Hamilcar agreed, on one condition. He led the boy to the altar, asking him to place his little hand on it. And then he said to his son, words that will echo through history. Place your hand on this altar and swear that you will never be a friend of Rome. That boy, of course, was Hannibal Barca. The oath of a 9-year-old would soon become the most terrifying nightmare the Roman Republic had ever faced. The First Punic War is over, but its ashes have sown the seeds of an even greater and more devastating conflict. The story of Hannibal Barca and the greatest revenge in history will be told in the next part. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the Second Punic War.